First, I want to say I arrived about an hour ago, and just from hearing your remarks, I think that I'm going to be preaching to the choir here today. So you can pretend that this presentation is for more of a John Q. Public or a John Q. Caregiver instead of you all, because from your comments, I think you know a lot of this. But on the screen here is my father-in-law. I'll refer to him as Phil, which is how I refer to him in my columns. Phil was 96 years old and living independently in St. Louis last spring when he was hospitalized with pneumonia. After a week, the doctors released him to my husband's care, and Phil moved in with us. Knowing there are many people in similar situations, I pitched the idea for a weekly column about caregiving to the Kansas City Star. My Caregiving 101 columns ran from June of last year through February of this year. I resolved from the beginning to be very respectful to Phil, even while revealing some very personal details in the newspaper. But I spilled specifics about tough issues we encountered, hard decisions we made, and how we struggled with a lot of things. I shared those particulars with my readers, hoping they could learn something from my experience. But what I didn't anticipate was the many things I would learn from Phil. I had some pretty set notions about what he needed in terms of his health, his medicine, his diet and exercise, and how he should be spending his last years. I was his caregiver. He was my patient, my ward. I was younger, physically stronger, mentally sharper, better educated, more tech savvy, more in touch with science and medicine. I was better equipped to guide him and make decisions. I sensed similar judgments from some of the clinicians we took Phil to see. One physician in particular encountered Phil hunched over in his wheelchair, dressed in his stained sweatshirt, and past due on a haircut and shave, and he probably hadn't bathed in several days. Because he didn't like wearing his hearing aids, Phil talked too loudly, and he couldn't hear the doctor's soft-spoken replies. So after a while, the doctor started talking to us instead of to Phil. Phil told the doctor that his main concern was his strength. He wanted to feel better and get back to his own home, but his recuperation was taking too long. The physician chastised Phil for not wearing his hearing aids. Both men were talking. I'm not sure either was listening. The clinician saw a dirty, stubborn old man, and that clinician stopped listening. Phil, who holds physicians in high esteem and usually abides by whatever they tell him, went in hoping for help in regaining his independence. When the doctor failed to address his concerns, Phil stopped listening. The clinician failed to look deeper. He made a quick surface assessment and didn't go any further. He didn't learn that Phil was the oldest of 4 boys, whose mother died when they were under 10, and who kept the family fed on many occasions by breaking through ice to fish in the creek or by snaring rabbits. And that because they lived on so little money for so long, Phil never throws anything away. And he'll wear clothing that's faded and stained, but still soft and comfortable because it still has value. And it would be wasteful to pitch it. He didn't know that Phil was an ace baseball pitcher in high school or put himself through the University of Iowa. He had no idea that Phil joined the Army Air Corps and was stationed first in Alamogordo, New Mexico in support of the Manhattan Project. He was there when the first atom bomb exploded. Then all over Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific during World War II and the Korean conflict. He had no way of knowing that Phil became a private pilot, or that he worked for McDonnell Douglas on the Gemini and Mercury space programs. He didn't learn that Phil still owns a farm in Illinois and had been managing it, as well as his house in St. Louis, all of his finances, 2 vehicles, a computer, which he used to surf the web and play internet chess, not to mention personal relationships with 4 children, 3 children, 4 grandchildren, and 7 great-grandchildren, whom he frequently phoned or sent articles in the mail regarding current events or job opportunities or education or good stock buys that he'd found for them. All of this Phil had been managing independently up until last April. Dirty, stubborn old man? No. Phil is a fascinating, intelligent, sharp old man with a lot to share. But the clinician had no way of knowing any of that because he didn't listen. Consequently, both men were frustrated, neither learned from the other, and Phil's needs, diabetes, COPD, hypertension, and his desire to regain strength and independence were unmet. It's hard to really listen and understand what Phil or any other patient is saying. I understand that. It's hard for me, and I've known Phil for almost 35 years now. I know you've heard others today talk about the value of learning from your patients, and I'd like to share just a couple things that worked for us. Phil is a big talker, but not a very good listener. When there's conflict, he tends to get very emotional, very stubborn, although he'll say, "I'm not stubborn, I'm independent." He tends to shout and to shut down his listening mode, but he likes to read, and I noticed that he would pore over books and newspaper articles and internet articles, frequently highlighting or underlining things that were pertinent to him, and that got me thinking. I started printing things out for Phil, physicians and therapists' recommendations, articles about his conditions. He would read and reread them, slowly digesting the information over a period of hours or days. When we had big decisions to make, I started making lists for Phil. Sometimes I would just write out the facts in short, simple sentences. Here's an example of a time when Phil needed some rehab. He was spitting mad that we'd taken him to this facility. Leaving this list with him helped him to calm down, think about the situation, and study his options. And I even put this one in plastic for him because I was afraid he was going to tear it up or throw it at me. He was also a prodigious writer, lists, letters, journals, all the time writing things down. So sometimes I engaged Phil in the writing process too, asking him to contribute his ideas and opinions. On this occasion, I gave Phil 3 sheets of paper for each of his 3 residence options: our home, his house, and a veterans nursing home. I made 3 columns on each page: pro, con, and what we need to do to make this happen. I filled in some of my ideas and then asked Phil to add his remarks. We were surprised by several things he wrote that he had never mentioned aloud, especially this one. Can you read that? What? He was referring to a guest bedroom in our walkout basement that we thought he had always enjoyed. It was an easy fix that time to tell him he could have a bedroom upstairs instead. But without that list and his written remarks, we may never have discovered many of these kinds of things. The patients you come across may look to you kind of like that old pot that's been going around. This pot belonged to Phil. He used it in his house every day. He rarely washed it, and it was never put in the cabinet. He cooked in it for decades, only occasionally rinsing it before returning it back to the stove. My husband was horrified that Phil was still using this charred old pot to boil his water for coffee every morning. So he confiscated the pot and bought Phil a new one. Phil was incensed, and he thundered at my husband, "Don't you throw away my pot. That's a perfectly good pot. I've had it for over 50 years. That pot cooks evenly. It's just the right size for what I need. That pot does a great job for me." On and on about the pot. Well, guess what? That pot is just like Phil. On the outside, charred, dented, the copper shine long covered over. But hidden inside, history, value, knowledge, strength, usefulness. I shared my experiences with Phil in the newspaper because I thought they could be helpful to others. And by the feedback I received, I know that this was true. As journalists, we have to be careful about the details we reveal and how we reveal them. But we should share as much information as we can because we never know what experience, what idea, what insight, what admission of failure or celebration of success might be helpful to somebody. Thank you.